Hello, Year 11. So what I thought I'd do is make a quick video on the how useful question for today. And that way you can pause it, you can do it at your own pace, and therefore there isn't so much time pressure with it. Okay. So this is the source, and you can see here, this is source A. It's an artist's impression of a scene in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. It was printed in the penny illustrated paper, a cheap weekly newspaper. So there were these quite cheap weekly newspapers that a lot of people bought. And the police constable is from H Division. Remember, H Division is the one that looks after Whitechapel. And the building behind him is a police station. So you can see here he's with this crowd of people. It looks like he's struggling to control this crowd of people. He's got his whistle in his mouth. Remember, that calls attention or alerts someone of problems. You can see here we've got some clenched fists from the crowd, and it looks like the police officer is really struggling to control this. It almost looks like a riot. So just a reminder of our lovely phrases. Remember, the more we can learn these lovely phrases, the easier it will be for you to actually analyze these sources, because actually you can just take bits that you already know and you can just apply them to the sources. So the question today is, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the effectiveness of the police in Whitechapel in 1888? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your own knowledge of the historical context. So again, we're just going to focus on one source, because actually if we perfect one source, then the second source should be relatively easy as well, because you just do exactly the same. So we're just going to perfect this one source. So the first thing we've got to do, remember, is make an initial judgment. So you link that to the inquiry. It's always important, whatever written subject you do, you link things to the question straight away. So I've given the example for you here. So the sources are extremely useful for an inquiry into the effectiveness of the police in Whitechapel in 1888. Then we've got to state the nature, author, and purpose of the source and why this might be useful. Again, this is where we'll use our lovely phrases. So you're looking at the nature of it, what type of source is it, who is the author, what was the purpose of producing it. So when we're looking at this source, the source is produced in 1888. It's an illustration, and it appeared in a newspaper, in this cheap newspaper. And this is useful because it shows you the problems that the police haven't, but we've got to remember to use that lovely phrase. So it gives us an insight into how the people perceived the police at this time. In terms of C, we then introduce some of the limitations. So we use one of those connectives. So however, or nevertheless. Then we just discuss its potential limitations of the nature and author. So this source could have limitations because it could be easily exaggerated. Remember, this is an illustration. Illustrations can be easily exaggerated. It's a drawing, and anyone can draw whatever they like. So it's not a photograph of the situation. And again, it's produced in this newspaper, in this very cheap newspaper, and they're looking to sell newspapers. So often they'll sensationalize these newspapers. They'll make them seem worse than things are because they want to sell these newspapers. So that potentially is a limitation with it. Remember, we're looking at how useful something is, or how helpful, and if it's got limitations, sometimes it's not as helpful. So the content of it, and I've described this before, but obviously it's this police officer struggling with this crowd. He looks like he's lost control of it, and he's having to use his whistle to call for help. So then we state why the content is useful. So the question is asked me about the effectiveness of the police. Now, looking at this source, I'm thinking, ooh, the police are struggling here. So this source is useful because it shows you how difficult the job of a police officer in H Division was at the time in 1888, and how they were struggling actually to maintain order in this place. And I know that, and I need to use my own knowledge that police officers, when they went on the beat, remember it was 30 minutes during the day, 15 minutes at night, they would do it on their own. And actually the police officers, or the police in entirety at this time, they were quite small in numbers. So actually they would have struggled if there was something out of the ordinary going on. So I know that actually police officers did do the beat on their own. So you can see this one guy here. And therefore it does seem to reflect actually what the situation was in Whitechapel at the time. In terms of, I've then got to give another reason. So make sure you give two reasons, not just one. Some of you in the last one just gave one. You've got to give two. So another reason why it's useful is it shows you, well, it shows to me the tools that the police officers had at the time. So you can see here that he's having to use his whistle. So it shows me about the types of things they do. So what they'll do is actually they'll call for help. And I'm going to try and use my own knowledge for that. So I know that the police officers, they wore this basic uniform, they had a truncheon and they had a whistle, and that was about it, really. So in terms of its effectiveness, did they have the tools they needed in order to be effective? Well, it would look like potentially not, looking at this source. And then remember, I'm going to link back. So it is therefore clear that this source is useful when looking at the effectiveness of the police in Whitechapel, or the lack of effectiveness. So if I just go through the whole thing that I've kind of penciled out, remember, you don't need to use this word for word. This is just an example that I've given. So I've said the sources are extremely useful into an inquiry into the effectiveness. I said the sources, a drawing produced in 1888 that appeared in a cheap newspaper. Then this is useful because it's an interesting perspective from the time of the difficulties faced by the police. So I'm looking at effectiveness. I'm saying, look, they're struggling. It's difficult. However, the source has limitations because it could be easily exaggerated. And I could have said there, as it is an illustration. And the reason for that is it could be exaggerated in order to sell newspapers, to sensationalize things, to make things seem worse than they were. So I could have added to that bit there. I could have made that more interesting there. In the source, we can see police officers struggling with a crowd in the London district of Whitechapel, which is clearly evident. The source is useful because it shows how the police struggled to control disorderly people in Whitechapel. I know that the police would go on the beat themselves and therefore would struggle if the crowd got out of control. The source is also useful, I potentially should have said there, because it shows that the police had limited protection, as here you can see the police officer blowing his whistle. I know that the police would only carry a whistle and a truncheon and would often be insufficient if there were problems. It is therefore clear that the source is very useful for this inquiry. Okay, I hope that helps. Well done.